Already, your TA facilitator, and with me today are your TA team, Shamisa Radford, Ashley Kerr, Olga Mulherin, and Mike Lindsay. Many of you have met us before, so I don't think any introductions are needed again. And also, I just want to let everyone know that Caroline Krause from HUD is here with us today. So today's session is the second part of a two-part series that is training on CoCs. So these two sessions have been specifically developed and designed to provide you, the attendees, the Tribal Homeless Network, with a basic understanding of what a CoC is, its purpose, how they function and their structure, and today, much of it is going to be on the funding part. So it's an hour long, and we're going to have 30 minutes at the end for question and answer, discussions, etc. And as was the case on Tuesday, August 20th, today's 22nd, the training part of the session is going to be recorded so that tribal partners and friends who could not attend these have access to them. However, we are not going to record the question and answer discussion part. So feel very comfortable to, share your concerns or questions or discussions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ashley Kerr.
Thanks so much, Sita. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Very happy to see you all and really excited to talk about the two pathways with the CoC program that we're going to discuss today, including the funding as Sita talked about. I wanted to start today's discussion with a quick recap of Tuesday's training. And just a reminder, we've said this multiple times, but that training session was recorded. It'll be combined with this training session, and all of that information will come out to you all shortly. But we talked about the definition of the CoC, which is a planning body that coordinates the housing and services for people experiencing homelessness in your community. We also talked about who is eligible to receive CoC-funded housing and services, those households that are currently experiencing homelessness or are imminently at risk of becoming homeless. We talked about the definition of a CoC project, which is a grouping of eligible CoC program activities, and what a recipient is, right? Which is the entity that signs the grant agreement with HUD and operates the project. And we talked about the different eligible activities, such as rental assistance and supportive services. We also talked about several CoC program requirements that tribes and tribally designated housing entities, or TDHEs, as I'm going to refer to them as, will want to discuss as they consider whether or not CoC funding will be beneficial in your community. And lastly, we talked about the cost sharing requirement of the CoC program, which is 25% of the total cost of the CoC project, less any leasing dollars. Our team debriefed after the training and just talked about, things that we did discuss, questions, and how we wanted to go into today's session. And the one thing I didn't explicitly state is that CoC funding is not meant to solve all of the issues related to homelessness in a community. Rather, it really is just one resource that a community can use along with others to prevent and end homelessness. The reality is that CoC funding cannot solve all the problems and issues because there isn't enough funding within the program to do so. Communities really need to consider all available funding sources, which are both public and private, to address homelessness. So, there are two primary paths for participating in the CoC program. The first is to join an existing CoC and apply for funds through the existing CoC's annual competition. And I can't remember if I said this, but just to make sure, CoC stands for Continuum of Care, which is a HUD program. The second option is to establish a new CoC that is separate from any of the existing CoCs in your community, and you can pursue funding that way. And just remember, as we talk about establishing a new CoC, that one or more tribes, TDHEs, or communities can actually come together and join together to create one CoC. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we talk about path 2. We're going to dive deeper into path 1 before we talk about path 2. So joining an existing CoC. If you are interested in joining an existing CoC, it's likely that your intent is ultimately to apply for and receive CoC program funds for a project. And remember, that project is a group of eligible activities for the CoC program. And the recipient is the organization that receives that grant award and operates that project. For the purposes of this conversation, though, I'm going to use the term organization because recipient means that you have received project funding. And what we are talking about today is the organization that applies or pursues the CoC funding. If you decide that it would be best for you to pursue project funds through an existing CoC, rather than establishing a new CoC, your recipient organization will be engaging in many activities, and I've organized it today into 3 categories: participating in the CoC's activities, submitting an application, and operating housing and homeless services projects. Before I go through these categories, I want to acknowledge that each of you is likely to be in a very different place in terms of deciding on your CoC program path. Some of you may be interested in applying for project funds in the current competition, which is open right now, in which case you'll be engaging in activities very quickly. Some of you are going to be thinking about this may be a possibility for your tribe or TDHE in the future. In that case, you should just keep these activities in mind as you consider whether to participate in the program. So the first category of activities related to this path is participating in CoC-related activities. Even if you are not entirely sure you want to pursue this path, you can take some preliminary steps that could help you determine whether this path will have any benefit to you. And even if you have not developed any sort of specific project for which you want to apply, you can start having those discussions and start engaging in CoC activities. These include attending CoC meetings. You need to ask your CoC or check the CoC's website for meeting dates and times. The CoC is required to have full membership meetings twice a year, but there should likely be other open meetings or committee meetings that you can attend. You can also volunteer to serve on the CoC board of directors or a committee like the rating and ranking committee, right? Or the HMIS and data committee. Different committees, each CoC has their own set of committees, although you'll find some generalities across all CoCs. There's also this annual survey called the Point in Time, and PIT count is what it says on the slide here. HUD requires this annual survey, and CoCs are responsible for counting the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in their communities. Typically, CoCs rely not only on the CoC staff, but a lot of volunteers for help in this process, and it happens at a certain point every year in January. And if you're ready to discuss project ideas and budgets, you can absolutely do so at any time with the CoC. Regardless of where you are in this decision to pursue the path, it's important to know that a CoC is not allowed to include a project application from a tribe or TDHE without permission granted with a tribal resolution. So if there is interest in pursuing this path, it is recommended that you start the conversation around tribal resolution and that process sooner rather than later, because we all know that tribal resolution processes and getting on agendas all varies from tribe to tribe. The second category is submitting an application, and I've divided this into 2 parts. One is the local competition process, and the second one is the application itself. So I'll provide a little information about the CoC program competition process just to give you some context when I talk about the local competition. In broad terms, your application is submitted to HUD, it is reviewed by HUD, and it is awarded by HUD. But the CoC, the local CoC, decides whether to select your application and forward it to HUD. If the CoC does not select your application for consideration, you have the option to submit through an appeal process as a solo application, but that is rarely done. And that information is in the actual NOFO, that notice of funds opportunity that comes out during the annual competition, that information on how to do that. To make its decisions, the CoC is required to develop a fair and transparent process for selection, and they have to publicly communicate it. Typically, this means that a CoC publishes a request for proposals, an RFP, and solicits applications for projects. It then typically has a committee that reviews the project applications, accepts or rejects them, and then for those it accepts, it ranks them. Once the project applications are selected and ranked, they're submitted to HUD as a package. It's the review process and the project criteria that are key here. Each CoC has a different process and different criteria. The RFP should identify CoC priorities, the selection process, and the criteria for selection. So if you're interested in joining a CoC, you would benefit from reviewing the most recent RFP and then asking the CoC questions about it. And likely because the competition is open, that is happening in real time. If you're interested in applying for funds this year, right, you need to move on this very, very quickly. If you're interested in it in 2 years, right, because we are under a 2-year NOFO, then it would really help to see the calendar because some CoCs have a very early start date, but it also will give you a chance to become familiar with the local process. When the CoC establishes its selection criteria, it should be assessing the needs of those who are houseless and housing insecure in the community and prioritizing the kinds of projects that will best meet the community's needs. That means it will favor certain project characteristics over others, and that will change from competition to competition. Once you know you want to apply for funds, you will need to become familiar with an online grants application system that is referred to as eSnaps. There's a web page that we can put in the chat later and make sure it goes out with everybody that talks about eSnaps and all of the instructions. But what you'll have to do, right, if you put forth an application and it gets accepted, is that you'll need to enter information about your organization, the legal entity that applies for the funds. You'll have to enter information about the application. You'll have to include your budget information, and then you're going to have to include your match information as well. That was a lot. Okay, let's go to the third criteria. Excuse me, the third category. This is operating housing and homeless service projects. So once an organization is awarded funds, it operates the housing and supportive services project that receives the CoC program funds. And remember, this means that the project has to serve eligible participants who we discussed in or during Tuesday's training. It has to conduct the activities that were explicitly stated in the application, and those, of course, have to be eligible. It can spend money, this project, on eligible costs, and it has to document lots of different things related to this particular grant, including how you determined that a program participant was eligible, what activities that were undertaken, and what you spent money on, including really from start to finish, right? So there's a lot that goes to putting together a project and then operating a project. But of course, there are instructions out there on how to do that, and your CoC can help. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath. We're going to move into path 2. And I know I'm going super fast, but there's just lots of information that I want you all to have. Okay, let's talk about establishing a new CoC. If you've decided to establish a new CoC, let's talk about what this entails. You have to establish a CoC board. All CoCs have a governing body that acts on its behalf. Most function like a board of directors. The CoC makes a determination about what the board will be responsible for and decision-making. That board must then represent the relevant organizations and subpopulations of people experiencing homelessness in your community. And there has to be at least one person who is currently experiencing homelessness or experienced homelessness at one point, right? So making sure that there is lived experience on that particular board. The CoC also has to designate a collaborative applicant. We're going to talk about the responsibilities of the collaborative applicant, but the primary one is that it is the selected organization to submit that application package to HUD. This is generally a pretty large undertaking. Most collaborative applicants do more than just manage the annual competition, but we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. And then you have to operate the CoC. In the CoC program interim rule, HUD states that for a CoC to be functional, it needs to conduct a number of activities throughout the grant year. These include, but are not limited to, those meetings that I discussed a little bit earlier, inviting new members to the CoC, appointing committees and subgroups to support the work of the CoC, establish written standards for assistance, monitor recipients, and evaluate outcomes. It also has to designate an HMIS lead agency and a coordinated entry lead agency. And we're going to talk about what those two things are a little bit later, but those are legal entities that will administer and run these particular types of programs. In saying that, the collaborative applicant, HMIS lead, and coordinated entry lead agency can be the same entity. They can also be different entities. It varies across the country. And then I talked about the point in time count, but that's conducting the annual data collection as the last bullet here on the slide. One thing I want to mention as I talk about a CoC board of directors is, right, the CoC program typically thinks about a board of directors, right, because very often these are local governments or these are nonprofits that are participating in the CoC program. Tribes and TDHEs are different. So a CoC board, or let me rephrase this, the tribal council could serve as the CoC board. You could have the board of the TDHE serve as the CoC board, right? There are a variety of different ways to put together this board requirement, but I just wanted to point that out because there are already established governmental processes in place within a tribe, right, that we had not thought about prior to 2021 when tribes and TDHEs became eligible for the CoC program. There are some other things to be a CoC. You have to develop written standards for assistance. So communities have to draft these written policies on who is going to be served and how people will be served if they are experiencing homelessness. You also have to develop standards for maintaining compliance with federal grants. For instance, a community could limit rental assistance for a certain period of time simply because that is what is needed in your community, and maybe you have limited rental assistance units out there and you want to be able to serve as many people as possible, right? But that is what the CoC establishes as a collective body, these written standards for assistance. The CoC also has to monitor recipients. So because CoCs are governed by the program interim rule, the CoC is responsible for monitoring grant recipients for both compliance and effectiveness. Compliance really relates to the CoC program interim rule. Did they serve those eligible participants that they said they were going to? Did they, if they said they were going to house 10 households, did they house 10 households, right? But you also have to think about the effectiveness piece, right? If a project said that they would serve 10 households, but they served 15 households, right? Were they more effective? What were the reasonings behind it, right? So there is this monitoring piece that comes along with CoC status. And of course, submitting that annual application. And it's a big process, right? There's a local competition process that I just talked about earlier when I was talking about joining an existing CoC. And then you have to put it all together in a consolidated application. So it's a big undertaking. I am not going to go into all of this, but what I will say is HUD does have some annual requirements for the collaborative applicant. And you will see here that it's broken up into quarters. Again, these are sort of moving targets because You never necessarily know when the competition is going to drop or be released, right? But there are some things that you have to think about, such as program registration, the housing inventory count, grant inventory worksheets, the data collection, et cetera, et cetera. So this is often what you see a collaborative applicant doing in addition to operating the CoC. So what needs to be in place before you become a new CoC? One, you really need to think about what needs are in your community. Who are the people experiencing homelessness? And you have to make sure that this program funding really aligns with what you need in your particular community. The tribe will also want to think about, or TDHE will want to be able to sort of scale up or scale down staffing depending on size of a grant, right? So one of the things that you think about as you apply for funding, it may be that there's an existing program that's out there and you are expanding it. It may be that there is a totally new project that you want to throw your hat in the ring, and it's going to really start from the ground up. So needing to think about what staffing and staffing up, scaling down will be, depending on whether or not you get this funding. The entity also has to be eligible, and they have to be able to accept federal funding. And there is some threshold information here. Just really one, aside from eligibility, the question is, does this particular entity have internal controls in place for handling federal funds, right? Can you track the money that is being utilized for this particular project? Can you report out on it? All of those things HUD is really going to be looking for to ensure that the project, the entity that has the project, is a good steward of federal funding. And then you also need to think about other funding supports, other funding sources to support the project, because you're going to need to have a 25% match unless you are having a leasing line item. But you really need to think about, are there other sources that can help supplement? Are there additional projects and sources that might be able to complement the work that you're trying to do? But again, the CoC program needs to fit within your community's needs. Having said that, let's talk a little bit about HMIS and a little bit about coordinated entry. I'm not going to take a deep dive into either one of these, but these are two things that are required if you have a CoC. So HMIS stands for Homeless Management Information System. And what it is, it's this locally administered electronic data collection system that stores longitudinal person level information about the people who access the system, the homeless response system, right? So the people who are requesting assistance for housing or services. Each CoC is responsible for selecting an HMIS software that complies with HUD's data collection, management, and reporting standards, right? This isn't just a Google sheet. This is a database that has the ability to store longitudinal information. It has to have certain standards around privacy and confidentiality and around data management. There are data and technical standards that HUD has published that really establish a baseline of information of requirements for HMIS. But again, there is a lot of reporting that comes out of the HMIS. And so you need to have a software that can handle all of the reporting requirements in addition to all of the data standards and privacy and confidentiality requirements. You may be asking what kind of information goes into an HMIS. This is really basic demographic information, household composition, income information, diagnoses. So if somebody has a mental health diagnosis or a substance use disorder, or maybe even some type of medical conditions, that information may be stored in the HMIS. Again, it has to be secure, but the reason it's really important to have this level of information is it really informs local planning. It allows you to identify the gaps in housing and services. It allows you to think about who and trends and who's experiencing homelessness. It really helps support the reporting for local programs so that you have information. These programs have information at their fingertips about who they're serving, how they're serving, right? Are they being efficient and effective stewards of the federal money? And it really also helps enhance participant support. So there is the ability of an HMIS, let's just say CETA comes in requesting services and assistance, and she has received services from another organization. I may have the ability, depending on our data sharing information, that knows that CETA has also sought services somewhere else, so she doesn't have to tell me the whole story again, which can be a very traumatic experience, and really thinking about how we are minimizing the trauma in the times that people have to tell us their story over and over again. So again, I have not taken a deep dive. There are entire series of products and trainings around HMIS, but I just wanted to let you know that each CoC needs to have one of these, and you have to have a vendor and a lead agency who will administer it. And here you can just see the roles for HMIS, right? So you have governance, you have rules about how that HMIS will be used. Those rules govern the HMIS lead agency and the HMIS vendor. That is who has the software. You then have participating organizations, and then you have the end user. So let's say that I'm a participating organization. I receive CoC project funds. My organization is ABC Incorporated. The end user would be Sita, who happens to be my team member, and she is the one who is inputting the data into the system, right? So you have a variety of roles in an HMIS. Again, we can talk about that in more detail if you'd like. Let's talk about the other requirement, and then I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the funding. And again, sorry for all of the information, but I really want to make sure that y'all have this. So coordinated entry is this process that standardizes the way that people who are seeking services can access those services, can be assessed for those services, and ultimately prioritized and referred for those services. Each CoC has to have a coordinated entry system, and typically one organization serves as the lead agency, and that lead agency administers the system and ensures that it is coordinated across the entire geographic area of the CoC. All CoC recipients of project funding must participate in the coordinated entry system. Okay, let's talk about funding availability. So when we started discussing the two options for participating in the CoC program, I mentioned that there's like this decision-making approach that really considers three elements: the activities that you want to undertake, the roles and responsibilities that go along with participating in the program, and then the amount of funding that you could potentially receive. Let's discuss how the funding works in the CoC program. Every CoC, whether it is new or existing, has a cap on how much funding it can apply for. The amount is different for every CoC, and that cap is predetermined, meaning that the CoC program NOFO, before that is published, that information has already been established by HUD. And the cap is a combination of different types of funds. So forgive me in advance. I'm going to be using lots of acronyms, but I will try very hard to define them. Nearly all existing CoCs have projects. HUD determines a value that it calls the annual renewal demand, or ARD, as you see here on the screen. If the CoC wants to renew all of the projects that were eligible to renew in that particular year, then that's the total value, right? The ARD is the annual renewal demand of the existing projects. New CoCs do not have any projects, so your annual renewal demand, or ARD, is zero, right? So when you think about the pros and cons of joining an existing CoC versus establishing a new one, this is really important. An existing CoC has a value to their ARD. The new CoC does not yet. Each year, the Congress passes its Appropriation Act. And sometimes, well, by the way, that contains information in the amount of money that is allocated for the CoC program. But there is sometimes set aside money called bonus funds. These are literally funds that are a bonus to the regular amount that would be used to renew projects and create new projects. So for the last several years, we've seen a couple of different types. One is a CoC bonus, and the NOFO will state about what type of projects can apply for CoC bonus funds. There have also been DV bonus funds, or domestic violence bonus funds. This is housing and services specifically for people who are fleeing situations of domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual assault, and stalking. There is also the collaborative applicant funds, and this is calculated as a percentage of that formula amount, which will get capped at a certain point, but you can now have a minimum threshold of $50,000, and that's really for planning money, planning activities, so you can help make sure that the CoC runs. The collaborative applicant is the only entity that can apply for that collaborative, CoC planning grant. So the formula. It starts with the annual appropriations for the CoC program. It then applies a preliminary pro rata need formula. And the preliminary pro rata need is the amount that is designated across the CoC service area. So it's a dollar value. It does not mean that a CoC will get that amount of money. It is the formula for which projects are, the amount of the project is calculated. So this is where it starts to get really confusing. The other piece here is the final pro rata need. And this is the higher of that annual renewal demand, that ARD or the PPRN amount. So with the formulas, and they can change around the particular NOFO and how much you can ask for certain projects. For this particular year, the CoC bonus is 12% of the final pro rata need. The DV bonus has a 50K minimum. CoC planning, as I mentioned, has a 50K base, but you have maximum limits. And then there are these things called UFA costs, or Unified Funding Agencies. We can talk about that at a different time, but it is a specific designation of a type of CoC in which all of the funds run through one recipient, the UFA, and then the funds are distributed to a variety of subrecipients in the CoC. So the CoC program, right, HUD determines the PPRN by a formula, and the ARD is the real inventory. And then again, right, we're talking about FPRN, meaning the higher of the ARD or the PPRN amount. Caps are based generally on the ARD, not the PPRN, plus the bonus fund amounts and the grant amounts for the collaborative applicant. So there are a lot of different ways that things are calculated. The nice thing I will say, because I've talked about a lot of different percentages and numbers, is that HUD typically produces or publishes a report that gives each CoC the amount of money per these different pots. So they'll say what your ARD is, they'll say what your PPRN and FPRN are, and they will say how much you can apply for as it relates to the CoC or DV bonus or any other bonuses. So if you're joining an existing CoC, you'll want to have a sense of how much funding might be available. Is there enough for one project? Is there enough for more than one project? So you have to think about, will you be applying for a new project, which would be one of those bonus funds if they exist, or there will be renewal projects that will be applied for. New projects are ones that have not existed before. renewal projects are the ones that exist and are eligible in a particular year to be renewed as that particular project application and get awarded funds to operate the project for another year. So again, all of this information is laid out in each year's NOFO. But if you have a new project, right, if you're new to the CoC, but you want to submit a project, the way that it's going to work is either through a bonus project or through reallocation. And what that means is that the CoC, what reallocation means, at its very simplest, is that the CoC had a project and it was not performing up to what it needed to perform. And that is typically how funds get reallocated. And then what happens is those funds get brought back into the general pool and are available for a new project to put in and apply for.
California for a couple days, but he'll be back. Okay, that'll be there.
John, do you might want to, yeah. Okay, thanks. Establishing a new CoC. A new CoC has no ARD, right? Because it has no projects. So there is going to be a PPRN that is calculated for the new CoC. And then that number is used to determine how much the new CoC can apply for two different types of grants. One is going to be that planning grant. And what you can use that planning grant to do is listed here on the slide, but really thinking about how your CoC is operating across the CoC. So really developing the system, thinking about the process of how all organizations can participate, putting that application together, and then monitoring and evaluating both projects and the recipients and subrecipients that have that funding. For bonus projects, it will be based on a percentage of the formula amount. And again, it's going to be specified in the particular NOFO about what you can and cannot apply for.